Welcome to the Dark Ozarks. There's monsters. From the British Isles to the Ozarks, monsters from the Celtic past are roaming around the 21st century. We will get back to that in a minute, but first we want to remind you that the Dark Ozarks podcast is now available on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or about any other podcast platform. So what monsters would the Celts recognize in today's Ozarks?
I think it's fair to say that there are so many that the Celts would recognize a number of them, or certainly forms of them. And as we were doing our research a week and a half ago for last week's episode, we realized there's so many monsters and beasties to consider that this makes part 2 of our material. So from old gods to mischievous supernatural beasts to monsters of a more mortal kind, there's a lot to cover, and more than a few familiar faces here in the Ozarks. And of course, that does include the Ozarks Howler.
We will return to what might be hiding in the dark or lurking under your bed. But first, we want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Dark Ozarks on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Substack, as well as your favorite podcast platforms. We also invite you to become a Dark Ozarks subscriber on Facebook. On the Dark Ozarks Facebook page, click subscribe, have your login information ready, and join Dark Ozarks behind the scenes for only $4.99 per month.
Your $4.99 per month subscription allows you to come with us on paranormal investigations, deep dive research, and topics too controversial for public view. The next 100 subscribers will be entered in a drawing for a free Dark Ozarks t-shirt and an exclusive signed first-run copy of the book Dark Ozarks, The Spooklight. Subscribe today to be entered in the drawing.
And now you can get Dark Ozarks t-shirts for sale at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com.
We encourage you to check out Always Buying Books in Joplin, Missouri, in person and online, on Facebook and at the website alwaysbuyingbooks.com for all of your reading needs, including a large section on the paranormal, history, and more. Not to mention, the building is haunted. Tell Bob and Elise that we sent you.
We also want to thank Beard Engine Brewing Company in Alba, Missouri. Beard Engine Brewing is the only English-style brewery in Missouri and has been twice named Missouri's best brewery by the Missouri Brewers Association. Great beer, great food in a historical building with a noir past. And yes, their building is also haunted. Tell Nate and Tiff that we sent you.
Oh, so we are back to monsters in the Ozarks. And you really cannot contextualize monsters in the Ozarks without dealing with monsters in Appalachia and monsters in the British Isles. That's
true. They're sort of a straight line over time between the three places for immigration as well as the beasties, whether they be of the mythical or the mortal kind.
Or a combination of the two. I think that's a weird moment of intersection.
Well, and that really kind of goes back to where the word monster comes from. It has a different meaning generally today than it did originally. It originated in the 1300s in the British Isles, actually, but it meant an unnatural event or being. So when we think of monsters as being a large animal or even a monstrous storm of a natural kind, that is a more modern conception than what originally a monster was.
It is. And what I would invite people to do and to consider is just how the shift of words changes our perception and explains or contextualizes the world around us a little bit differently. We have grown up with a very, I would say, strictly compartmentalized definition of the word monster.
Mhm.
That's even dating ourselves into this mindset of Scooby Doo, which I love. But Zoinks, it's a monster.
Yep.
It simply is a thing, and of course the monster gets unmasked, and we find out that it's Mr. Sneedley, the banker. But it's I really like coming back to this Middle English definition of a portent, an unnatural event, or a being that is associated with the portent or the unnatural event. And for some of us, I think probably more of us than popular culture gives credence to, some of us have had these experiences in which we realize that we are within proximity of something unnatural.
True. Often in today's society, there's then a reaction of trying to explain that away, or it has to be something natural. But certainly, a lot of people have had those kind of experiences. In fact, we had one come to us, an event we were at this weekend, about encountering a canine type of monster, but was viewed as much larger than any even wolf or anything else, that left the impression that it was aware of them and that it was not an ordinary animal. And I mean, that fits into a lot of the lore in the region, whether it's phantom dogs, booger dogs, or almost a shapeshifter, or one that we're going to talk about tonight is the snarly yow.
It is, and what I really just encourage listeners to think about as we delve into so many of these beasts, this compendium, that a commonality for many of them, not all, but a commonality for many, is that sense, for those who have experienced it, that sense in the back of your mind, this resonance that what you are encountering or what has been encountered is outside of normal.
Yes.
That
And
is, and normal being a corporeal world where things work as we can gauge and measure and anticipate, and suddenly something happens, and it might be a physical manifestation of a being, it might be something physical, it might be phantom like, but something that so many people walk away from these experiences saying is it was, and sometimes the word is wrong. There was something about it that was wrong. There was something about it that was weird. I love the reference used by Shakespeare, the weird sisters. There's something about them that is, if you're a Star Trek fan, you would call it interdimensional. It's the idea that it is vastly and genuinely other.
Yes. The something of the other is probably a really good way of putting it, that all of those things kind of fall into that basket. And in that sense, it really, the idea is continuous with the original meaning of what a monster was.
It is. And that for those who've encountered and then walk away from it, that they are left with a very strong sense of being deeply unsettled.
Yes. Or a changed type of awareness, or worldview.
And of course, you can't talk about these type of experiences, and we'll get to the this first beastie here in just a second. But these type of experiences, I would say it's fair that it is difficult for the human psyche or the rational conscious mind to fully understand. Is something that are oftentimes our, what is behind our conscious mind recognizes and reacts to the environment, whereas our conscious mind is just trying to keep up.
Exactly.
And something that I think, and this is not to weigh in on one side or other of the quote unquote alien debate, but that there's a strong similarity. Individuals experiencing something that is quote unquote wrong and not able to be understood oftentimes gets lumped into alien sightings, whereas years ago it would have been perhaps the Fae or something else.
Very true. Very true. But again, just on their own terms as alien sightings and the experience, it still fits into that same definition.
It does. So the snarly owl is actually from Appalachia and bears some interesting comparisons, some direct ties with beasties here in the Ozarks, as well as beasties in the Old World, specifically the British Isles.
Yes. If you go back to the Isles, you have all kinds of canine beasts, the black hounds, and then phantom booger dogs and various sorts that those tales all came to the New World with settlers. And the snarly owl actually goes back to colonial times, back east. And to be honest, I think it's kind of a continuation of the old tales, but garnered this new name. And I think snarly owl really came from the fact that when it's encountered, it tends to snarl at you and have large fangs and, interestingly, a red mouth.
Correct. And it's an interesting one to start with in terms of our compendium, because it is both physical and non-physical simultaneously. It is it appears and gives every indication that it is physical when it is manifested, and then it vanishes.
Yes. And sometimes without a seeming reason, and seems to appear to kind of terrorize the witnesses and then just disappear, which almost has a bit of a trickster aspect to it as well. But it is described as a massive four-legged beast that, for all intents and purposes, appears rather canine. Now, it tends to it would it is spirit in the essence that when it's shot at, bullets pass through it.
Right.
Which is interesting.
It's something that came to my mind just in terms of a couple of things. One, it appears to manifest and dissipate of its own will. It appears to target randomly.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, it could exist as a death omen, but it doesn't specifically appear to exist as a death omen.
No, it seems more like just to cause havoc. Traditionally, it would appear and scare horses so that they would throw the riders off, and then it would disappear. It didn't attack the riders.
And my more suspicious nature in terms of someone being targeted by the snarly owl and then saying, I don't know why this happened, the possibility that they might actually have done something to cause this, and they might actually know what that is, but it might be something that they don't want to talk about.
That's true. Almost a bit of karma in action.
It's something to consider. That's pure conjecture. But
Yeah.
in terms of a cross tie to the Ozarks, the Snarly Yow does have a lot of comparisons, obviously, with what we call a booger dog, black phantom dogs of enormous size and fearsome presence. Interestingly, and a little bit separate from the Snarly Yow, booger dogs are traditionally death omens here in the Ozarks. The Snarly Yow does not appear to be a death omen. And you can also trace, as you mentioned, all of this black hound or black beast lore in a pretty direct line back to the British Isles. The one that is of particular note for me is going straight back to Scotland, which is the Cooshie, the phantom dog.
Yeah. And I think that's likely what probably, especially in colonial times, it was compared to or reminiscent of for settlers. I do like the fact that the Snarly Owl is keeping up with the times, and it will now chase cars.
Yeah, as dogs do.
As dogs do, but causing accidents, startling the drivers, causing them to swerve and crash, and that it will stick around long enough to intimidate the driver before disappearing.
Which is admittedly terrifying. There is an aspect, and coming over to the Scottish Highlands for just a moment with the Cooshie. The Cooshie is essentially a fairy dog, and I think that that's an interesting term because we don't typically put those two words together in modern American culture, and but in terms of being monstrous, the Cooshie is oftentimes described as being the size of a small cow, and comes in a variety of colors, sometimes dark green. And the aspect of Fae, I think, is particularly of note in regards, and you could argue, or at least conjecture, that in terms of phantom, spectral, corporeal, non-corporeal hounds, that we're dealing with several different manifestations. The Snarly Yow really does fit the personality of the Fae.
Mm-hmm. It does. I mean, it's more mischievous and instead of attacking or death omen. And it occurred to me that one thing that will happen, even if they don't cause a car wreck, they'll chase cars and then just disappear. And this fits squarely in a report that we have out of the Rolla area of a woman driving down the highway, and this, monstrous black dog starting to chase her car and keeping up at highway speeds, and did so for a couple of miles and then suddenly just disappeared. And she never saw where it went.
Is frightening on all counts. And
yes, she was definitely freaked out and said that it took her several weeks before she would drive that way to work again.
And I believe that's fair. That is, again, something that is important to understand about the Fae, about the traditional nature of the fairies, where it's difficult to even say that word without bringing along a lot of 20th century and even 19th century baggage that we do not associate with the traditional lore. And so the idea that the Kushi, the fairy dog, is terrifying, monstrous, a bringer of chaos, although not necessarily a death omen, is an interesting side to this. And I like it because it begins to unravel one's perception of the term fae or fairy and what we're directly dealing with. So whether this is our first person or documented account near Rolla, whether it is some of Vance Randolph's lore with booger dogs, whether it is the Appalachian snarly yow, or whether it's the Kushi, we are looking at something that in terms of the lore traces its lineage to the ancient Celtic gods, the Tuatha De Danann. And these are beings that exert an enormous amount of power when they manifest and have a lot of potential chaos to create when they decide to show up.
Very much so. Very much so. And this is just a good illustration of that.
I'm also interested, of course, an aspect of British just history, of the history of the British Isles, that is an important tie-in because it affects Appalachian lore and it affects Ozarks lore, is the varying quote unquote mythologies that were brought together. And with I feel that with the snarly owl and the Kushi, we're looking at a decidedly Gaelic root of belief structure. But the Gaels, the Celts of the British Isles, are not the only peoples to be bringing their belief structures and their ideas into the mix. And we have the Anglo-Saxons, the Germanic tribes, originally from Western continental Europe, across the North Sea, from Britain, bringing theirs, as well as later waves of Vikings and of Scandinavian, ancient Scandinavian lore. And my what I'm conjecturing is that the Black Hound as a death omen may trace its roots back to our Germanic and Scandinavian lore and to the ancient gods of northern continental Europe, separate from the ancient gods of the Celts.
And I think that fits with the ancient lore of those groups very well. But it just speaks to the fact that there was this mixing of cultures in the British Isles, and then of course once over North America, even more groups being mixed in, that you do have these themes that are more dominant. And I think personally that there's a reason for that they resonate, because over time, and we're talking hundreds of years going on, thousands of years, that they resonate because there are types of experiences that people have had over generations that they recall this, and yes, that's what happened. That's what I saw. That's what happened to me.
And that really brings up a interesting intersection of ideas, because and I have my preferences are a mix of all of them, but one aspect of this is that there is a standard genre of unnatural events that we have not been able to effectively catalog. And so that around the world, certain types of strange and difficult to document or impossible to currently document phenomena occurs certain manifestations, certain things going on, and that each original culture, each primitive culture or ancient culture that has encountered these things that are all very similar, uh, created their own lore to explain a singular phenomena.
Mhm.
And I think that's reasonable because it does explain a certain aspect of similarity of lore,
Mhm.
in the sense that so many cultures around the world have a similar types of stories in their ancient structures. And so that one is the reasonable one. Me not being a reasonable person, also likes to jump over to the other, which is that each indigenous people groups gathering of lore, perhaps their gods and their supernatural entities and beings are unique, are unique to them, and not dissimilar to the quantum mechanics argument of many worlds, but rather than just many physical worlds, the idea of many other worlds that somehow resonate and connect with certain people groups or certain people of ancestral lines. What does seem to be consistent is that certain manifestations of lore follow certain people groups or certain peoples of ancestral lines from one geographical location to another, sometimes against their will. And so it brings up the question, for example, the Scots Irish, with their cosmology largely intact, albeit framed within a hearty Calvinist Presbyterianism, coming over to the New World, quote unquote, coming over to North America and setting up shop in Appalachia and later the Ozarks, but that certain aspects of the essentially the old beliefs, the manifestations of the old gods, still following from generation to generation. And there's an aspect to that possibility that I like because it is very, very textured and very complex, and it exists outside of time and space.
I like that, and maybe just me being me, but I think it's almost a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. I think there's aspects of both of those arguments that make sense to me.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, for me too, I from an ancestral perspective, there is a part of me, even though some of these manifestations are frightening
Mm-hmm.
for us, oftentimes as mere mortals, there is something to me that is very comforting and structural, but unique to many individuals. The idea that these things follow. It reminds me of and it's a funny story. It's not meant to be fully taken seriously, but as with many folk tales, I think there's a lesson thereof, and it deals with a Scottish boggart, uh, the old Scottish name for what we now would call a poltergeist. And the boggart is deeply mischievous and is haunting this poor family, tossing about pots and pans, breaking things in the kitchen, constantly raising a ruckus. And they finally have had it.
Mm-hmm.
They finally, the Scottish farmer has had it up here. He says, "That's it. We're moving. We're leaving the house. I'm not going to deal with a haunted house anymore. We're done." packs up all their stuff, moves to the opposing side of the valley. They've packed up all of their pots and pans and all of their belongings and shoved them in the wagon. They go to the other side of the mountain valley to move into a cabin there. And just as they arrive and they get ready to unpack things, the voice of the boggart comes from one of the big jars that they had pulled out of the kitchen, and the voice says, "Why did we move?"
I think that is apropos, and in a bit of how this does function in reality, almost to the point that people are not conscious of these things coming with them through time and through family lines, etc. But why some of this resonates, and it might not resonate with someone that doesn't have the same background.
Right. And along with this, I think something that is important to consider is that backing up with the industrialization of the 20th century. It's an industrialization that we've taken for granted. We love the amenities, we love the communication, we love the speed at which things occur. We are so inured within the industrialization that we actually become nostalgic about past iterations of pop culture's marketing. And I do that because I like save old magazines and crap and look over them and go, oh wow, that's how they did that. But we do. And something that we do not, I believe, fully take into consideration is that mass marketing, that mass industrialization of the 20th century stripped many of us of the conscious aspects of our ancestral ties.
Yes, but on a subconscious level, I think it's still there, and that's why these experiences resonate, or perhaps even why they still exist and still happen even.
Which is, certainly, I find, an interesting cosmology in Neil Gaiman's American Gods. The idea that as an individual pays homage to a god, it gains power. The god gains power, and as less homage is paid, the god weakens. And certainly, there's an interesting psychological, energetic manifestation concept within that worldview. And for the record, I love Neil Gaiman's work, and I love the novel American Gods, as well as many other of Neil Gaiman's works. But I personally, something that resonates with me is that this cosmology, or these mini cosmologies, simply exist, and we experience varying degrees of awareness, but that, for example, the Tuatha De Danann, full disclosure, this is my moment of confessional for myself. I believe the Tuatha De Danann exist, and I believe they exist in the other world, whether I pay them homage or not. But there are these points of intersection when we might encounter an aspect of them that the world around us seems to shift and shimmer and change. And depending upon the nature of the particular beings involved, that could be a very good thing, or that could be a very terrifying thing. And we proceed at our own risk, but also that something that perhaps explains the popularity of the ghost hunting shows. It explains perhaps explains the popularity of this interest in aliens and even just paranormal subjects in general, including us, is that we're dealing with a mass population that perhaps on a subconscious level or a spiritual level or a net, slightly removed level, we understand that there's more out there and that it's associated with our past and our ancestry. But we've all, to some degree, the cords have been cut consciously by modern society.
That's true. And ironically, as you were discussing that, made me think that this process or this concern is not even unique to modern culture. If you go back to the ancient Egyptians, their belief was that you would exist, you would exist in the afterlife only so long as someone remembered your name.
Mm-hmm.
And so that there is even 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, the idea of this continuity through time and what does it mean to continue or not continue is something that has been on the minds of people for thousands of years, and which also is why ancient Egyptian pharaohs tended to often destroy things erected by their predecessors or to remove their names from temples so that those other pharaohs wouldn't be remembered and they would.
Essentially destroying the competition.
Pretty much. But just in a sort of in a different way, it's the same concern that or idea that our beliefs, our gods, our beasties exist and follow us through time and generations. And what does it take for that to happen or not happen? So I always find it interesting when you have a theory or a mode of thought that has lasted that many thousands of years in some fashion. There seems to be something to it.
There are resonances within the idea, resonances within the cosmology, and I think that there's our very media driven, pop culture, product driven society at this point does strip us of our ancestral ties.
It does. And then, of course, just the notion of being a melting pot and so forth tends to do that on some level as well, for good and bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we definitely see that, and in micro, the Ozarks Plateau is an interesting space for that because we have seen cultures come in and be drastically changed in various forms and for various reasons. The one for me that is most striking is the considerable German immigration particularly in the 19th century into Arkansas, and quote unquote assimilation was so successful that a number of anthropologists seem to be unable to recognize the German influences of particular mountain communities, even as they continue to exist.
Yes, I found that odd as well. Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying it can be particularly helpful to approach it from a bit more of an embedded standpoint and a bit more of a gentle nuance. And it also helps if you know what you're looking for. And a clue is look for the food.
Yes, the food, the barns, the quilts.
The quilt. Mhm.
I'm going to throw you a curveball.
Okay, I'm ready.
Since we're talking about, monsters and monsters of a portent of a natural nature, the monster of current infamy in the Ozarks, of course, is the Howler.
Yes.
And to chagrin of many followers of the Howler, I think it's pretty clear that it's not a natural monster. It's not a natural animal.
Right.
How would you surmise the Ozark Howler in terms of being a monster?
And being a monster. Well, it has its own fan fiction and its own fan art. It it does the Howler existed as its own fearsome critter back in the day for a variety of reasons, but the lore associated with the original Ozark Howler is comparatively limited and stable and has been somewhat domesticated just within the structure of the legend. The legend itself is pretty compartmentalized as what it said it was, and as far as what it was used for. It was used, I believe, from what I can tell, for doing two things. One, telling original stories that would cause a shiver to run up your back as you were out in the wilds of the Ozarks in Missouri and Arkansas, being deliciously creepy to tell around the campfire, and also as a bit of a cautionary tale, just to remind us that there, certainly in the early era of pioneer settlement, that there were large predatory animals that were quite dangerous, particularly nocturnal ones, and that there was these unknown dangers that simply existed, and you needed to be on the lookout for them. That is a reality. Where the Ozark Howler then became more of a folk motif is when our original Ozarks families of settlement began to interact with tourism, predominantly brought in by local, our regional tourism in the 1920s and 30s, things like the Land of a Million Smiles, marketing campaigns, and then extending into the White River Country marketing campaigns, Table Rock Lake marketing, etc., and bringing a unique conflict, I would say cultural conflict, between your urban development people, your suburban landowners, and the traditional people who had been in the hills for generations. So we see that, and what we see is very traditional Ozarkers telling wild stories to see if they can fool the outsiders into believing them. And in these cases, we see the howler grow in proportion. It becomes the size of a bear. It starts to have horns. It has gigantic fangs or maybe tusks. Its eyes glow red. It does impossible things, not unlike the Snoffus, and it starts taking on these qualities. But it, up until recently, up until the internet, the Ozark Howler existed in that same category as, say, a jackalope. You go out on the prairie and hear the stories of the half jackrabbit, half antelope, sometimes with wings, those types of things. And It's not that far removed from Babe the Blue Ox. It's not that far removed from just this Americana folklore that has a larger story to tell in terms of early American settlement and coming into untamed spaces and finding new challenges and creating a unique Americana folklore that has resonance with the old world, but is also decidedly and uniquely North American. And I think, Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox and these kind of stories from the North Woods, from the Minnesota region, etc., is powerful because it begins to create a folklore that's establishing a sense of place. And this is establishing a sense of place that not very far beforehand was untamed space, was a territory in which no one was in. Suddenly the space has its own lore, its own new ideas that are connected with the past, that are connected with the land, that are creating a sense of idea and a sense of space and a sense of this is from whence we came. And you see that with Paul Bunyan in the association with the Northwoods logging. And I think with the Howler, you see that association of place with Ozarks hillbillies, with the tall tales in the rugged mountains of the upland South, these kind of things. And so the Howler traditionally existed within that fabric, and thanks to the internet, a handful of people plucked it from its fabric nest, its cultural tapestry, pulled it out, and then expanded it into something entirely larger and more grotesque, in the sense that it then began to get individuals creating its own fan art, its own cyber art online, and it grows in proportion. Its hair gets longer, its eyes become more red, its horns become more dramatic. It becomes terrifying. It becomes troubling, and it starts stalking people, etc. It becomes drastically more dramatic because it has been pulled out of just as I think real life flora and fauna keeps itself in balance within an ecosystem. You pull one of them out and give it lots of unnatural hormones, and it could grow into something scary, or basically a monoculture that you feed it and water it and give it all sorts of love and attention, and it might take over the lab. In the tapestry of lore, the same thing I think is potentially possible with our folkloric beast. You remove one from its contextualized tapestry around it that keeps it in balance, because if you the Howler's contextual cousins, the Jimplicute, a gigantic ghost dinosaur, the Snoffus, a great white deer that has dogwood blossoms growing out of its antlers, and it flies to the treetops and makes sneezing noises. The side hill hoofer, which is part antelope, but its legs are shorter on one side of its body than the other, so if you get it on the flat land, it tips over. These folkloric cousins kept the Howler contextualized, and when it gets pulled out by itself, it takes on a life of its own, and before long, people begin associating it and inflating it into something that it realistically is likely not, which is, for example, the physical, spiritual, corporeal, fae manifestation.
I I agree with you in large part. I find it interesting that in a lot of cases with quote monsters, they back, in the eons of time started out as quote, a real monster, something of a natural nature.
Mhm.
And then over time, people try to explain them in a natural way. I think with Ozark Howler, it's flipped because originally the tales, you had the tall tale aspect, but it came out of very real physical animals, mainly bears, large cats, etc.
Mhm.
That's where the stories came from. And now, as you said, in the internet age, it has morphed into something that when you just look at the current incarnation of the lore, would appear more of that traditional monster definition of something that's unnatural. It's that, or flip it on its head, the sort of the renderings that are coming out about the howler currently have a definite Bigfoot quality to them.
And that is a really interesting intersection because Bigfoot lore goes back in the Ozarks pretty much forever.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Ozark wild man, goes back at least to the 1830s. Even with notions that original, that the first sightings in the early 1800s in Northeast Arkansas were feral people who had uh, left the New Madrid area after the earthquakes, and then over time have turned into Bigfoot lore, aside from other unique Bigfoot lore like the Blue Man and Momo and the Fount Monster. And I do find it interesting that as the monstrous quality of the howler is growing, it's taking on connotations visually as it's depicted that most people, especially if you were not as aware of quote the howler, you look at the renderings and you say, oh, that's some sort of Bigfoot type creature.
That one is to me is a fascinating conceptual shift
Mm-hmm.
that we see because in its original state, the howler was a large, fearsome beast that was in the mountains that howled
Mm-hmm.
or yowled, honestly, is strongly associated with being a big cat.
Mm-hmm.
And as you noted, it has in pop culture, it has begun this morphing process. It's transmogrifying into the big red monster with sneakers on from Bugs Bunny.
Well, in some versions, a little more vicious version of a monster.
I will love him and hug him and squeeze him and make him George. It I love Looney Tunes for anyone listening, but yes, and for me it's a weird juxtaposition because I initially never contemplated that anyone would actually take the howler seriously. I think
Mm-hmm.
that is my point of fascination and mixed with consternation, because I really never thought from studying the lore that anyone would take that seriously. There are physical cryptids that I do take seriously. And the many aspects of Bigfoot is something I do take very seriously.
Same.
We've seen too many first person reports. to not say that there is something very solid in terms of an unknown physical manifestation going on. There are many aspects of the paranormal, as anyone familiar with the channel knows, that we take very seriously. I take it very seriously. And just in terms of me associating with my own ancestral cosmology of the Celts, the legends and the lore of the Tuatha De Danann are something that I also take seriously. I have not traditionally taken the Howler seriously because I am seeing the Howler through the lens again with its contextual cousins. The Jimplecoot and the Snawfish come to mind. A giant ghost, vampiric ghost dinosaur, and a large white deer with wings that has dogwood blossoms growing out of its antlers. That's where I've traditionally put the Howler. And then in times past, not terribly far removed, suddenly getting calls from sub-assistant reality TV show producers with South California phone numbers asking me, have I seen the Howler? Do I know anyone who has seen the Howler? Could I put them in contact with an individual who might have encountered a Howler? And it's probably a good thing that it wasn't a video call, because I was just sitting there with a look on my face going, what on earth are you talking about?
Yes, and then you sent them to me to answer their questions.
I did. I fielded some to begin with, for the record. I fielded some on my own to begin with. Then I just started sending them to you.
But I do find it interesting that in fact, there's a billboard on Highway 65 going to Branson with the Howler on it, and for a tourist coming through and seeing that, it's like, oh, okay, that's kind of like Bigfoot.
It does sound
and I think honestly, we do get input in our various outlets of people who seem to genuinely think that the Howler is I guess this is an oxymoron, but a legitimate cryptid in the Ozarks. And I think it really is for people who have their connection to the stories is from the internet only.
Yeah. Yes, it largely
its own on the internet.
It does. And within that highly public but compartmentalized subgenre, something that happens very quickly is that individuals interested in the Howler can, and it's an important topic because this happens with lots of other things as well, that it can create its own mini psychological weather pattern amongst those interested. But for those of us on the ground, those of us interacting with real people, real living, breathing, face-to-face people, that the Howler has comparatively little impact on Ozarks developing lore or ancestral lore. But if you get out into talking with everyday people, particularly rural people in the mountains, and you start bringing up Bigfoot, you start bringing up Black Panthers, you start bringing up large cats. In some cases, you start bringing up, UFOs or unidentified flying objects. You start bringing up paranormal experiences. You very quickly start encountering lots of people who either have had personal experiences with these, or they know someone personally and have had a first-person account told to them of these experiences.
Very much so. Very much so. And that is sort of the dichotomy with the Howler, is that I've yet to encounter anyone who's had an experience with the Howler.
No, and hearing a large cat or a bobcat howl is not the same as experiencing the cryptid, the howler.
Right. But it does kind of dovetail into a couple of other interesting monster type stories out of the Ozarks. One doesn't fit the traditional definition, but is certainly interesting, that there is a fairly long line of sightings of hyenas in Arkansas.
In Arkansas, yes. I'm very interested in this. I have not spoken personally to anyone who's seen a hyena, but it is the classic, not a cryptid, but an animal out of place.
Yes. I do also wonder if it does account for some chupacabra type sightings. People,
I was going to say that. Oh my gosh. You beat me to it. I was gonna say no, it's good. No, there are no such thing. There's no such thing as an Ozarks hyena. That is ridiculous. They don't exist. The answer is very simple. We're just seeing chupacabras.
and maybe we are, maybe we're seeing both.
Might be seeing both. Just when you thought it got simple. Yeah, so Arkansas.com actually had an interesting, from what I can tell, more of just oh, look at the fun folklore and the legendary monsters. But included in that was reports that were interesting in terms of they appear to be first person on the ground reports of individuals seeing a thing, and the thing looks like a hyena.
Yes. And from using deductive reasoning from the accounts, they appear that size wise, etc., it would be in line with a hyena. And except for the fact that it's in Arkansas, it would seem like a natural animal sighting.
Right, right. And this is something I can't help but draw some comparisons to. The Ozarks or borderlands of the Ozarks, animals out of place stories can be very interesting. Thanks to SEK Paranormal, one of the great groups, Southeast Kansas Paranormal, that we have the opportunity to work with at times, have collected stories of lions out of place.
Yes.
And
in multiple places.
Yes, and there's some very unique aspects that we can conjecture about that. And I also can't help but tie in the Springfield, Missouri Cobra scare of again, animals out of place. Nobody is arguing that lions, cobras, or hyenas do or do not exist. But what is deeply unsettling to individuals who've had these experiences is, yes, they exist, but they're not supposed to exist here and in this way. So what the heck is up?
Right. It certainly is an interesting example that
it is. So what do you think? I mean, we have we have a lot of different possibilities in terms of explanations. We have the animal got loose from the zoo. We have the animal got loose from the circus. We have the animal got loose from an exotic animal breeder. We have all of which tends to be more realistic. And I believe someone in Springfield actually came forward many, many years later and says, yeah, I was responsible. I kicked the door off of the cobra cage at the pet store. I'm still trying to figure out why the pet store had anyone.
Yeah, that's the one part that I'm not convinced on that story, but yeah. Someone did claim responsibility, but I'm not convinced.
of the long list of things to order for the pet store. How about a cobra? How about several of them? Nothing could possibly go wrong with that. Well, it was a simpler, earlier time. Pet stores had cobras. Not something I personally have on my top 10 wish list when I go to the pet store.
Same.
Um, saw him in the window and just couldn't come home without him. Um, but the those reasons existing. The other is the idea of a lost or hidden indigenous population of the animal.
Well, personally, I don't ascribe to the relic population theory. Sometimes it could make sense where you had an animal that may have survived up to a few thousand years ago. I think, maybe there could be a breeding population that survived in remote areas, but North American hyenas died out hundreds of thousands of years ago, like over 500,000 years ago. So I doubt that's the case. And for me, I doubt that they escape from the circus. You don't see too many hyenas in circuses and traveling circuses. Could not have not found anything to indicate that there were escaped hyenas from zoos or whatever that would account for this. So my guess is that an exotic breeder, that they got away. However, the reports are over a number of decades, so we're not talking about one animal or two animals. If people really saw hyenas at these various times over close to 50 years, there had to be a breeding population, which is even a little more far-fetched to believe, but I don't know. But
Right.
if it's happened, my guess is that they've gotten away from exotic animal breeder.
Yeah. And realistically, I think that's the answer. The other one that is fun, that is on the opposing spectrum, is the idea of some sort of portal that things are coming through from some place or some other time.
Well, I mean, and that does kind of go along with the pride of lion sightings in various places that all happened at the same time, that they were seen, even going down the street or whatever, and then vanish, almost like it was a interdimensional thing or time warp or whatever, almost as if they disappeared from the savannah and then appeared in the middle of Kansas and then disappeared. And so if something like that happened, maybe the hyenas came through similar time. It'd be interesting to note if there were any sightings of hyenas at the same time that the lions were. Maybe they came through with the lions. I don't know.
They might have. The thing that I like about these type of conjecturings, although some people may find it really unsettling or sometimes preposterous, is that it forces the mind to accept the at least even remote possibility that things in the world don't work the way we expect them to all the time, and that the world itself that may actually be much vaster and much more dramatic than we are led to believe.
That's true. We tend to like our little Chinese boxes and everything. It fits into a pigeonhole, and these stories do remind us that as much as we think we control our world, we may not.
And we may not. And that is not necessarily a bad thing, because it forces us to develop a greater awareness. And it also forces us to sometimes approach life with a bit more trepidation, but at least with a bit more sense of wonder than we've really been essentially indoctrinated into.
Agreed. Now, sense of wonder, how about let's talk about the felt monster for a second?
I love the Fog Monster. Of course, I've not
I
met
do
him
too.
personally. Um, the but the Fog Monster to me is particularly fascinating. We're dealing with we're dealing with a Bigfoot sighting.
Pretty much. Now, you know, one thing that's a little different is that supposedly it has 3 toes instead of 5. So some
Mhm.
people say that it can't be a primate, it can't be Bigfoot, and that may mean that it's a hoax. But I mean, there are similar accounts of Bigfoot-like creatures with 3 toes further south in the swamps and the marshes and so forth. So who knows? Um, and maybe just a large population with some sort of mutation. You know, you just want to throw something odd out there.
Right. I I love the fact for me the Fountain Monster is actually a lot more fascinating than the Howler.
Same, same. I agree. And this is something that again that you know there's sightings that go back to the 1850s, and then periodically since up until the last time I actually researched it. I think the last uh, reports that I had verified were just like 3 or 4 years ago. So
Which for a more corporeal cryptid sighting, that makes sense.
mhm,
The idea that we are I mean the basic conjecture is that we're dealing with a Bigfoot type um, a cryptid
mhm.
that existing in and around Boggy Creek and Fouke, Arkansas, which
Yes.
is close to Texarkana and close to the Louisiana state line.
Right, it's in the borderlands, but the same creature has been seen in other areas around there too. So it's not just quite that far south. But around Falk is where the sort of the clustering of sightings are, and where the more famous sightings are.
Mm.
So this could be a more wide-ranging creature, just like the Blue Man uh, has been reported through a pretty large swath of north central Arkansas and south central Missouri. So for someone saying, well, Falk isn't really the Ozarks. Well, I really, it is the borderlands, and the sightings and so forth are not just pinpointed on that dot.
Correct. And once you look at the aspects of borderlands, it's really important because it helps contextualize the Ozarks, and the Ozarks also help contextualize the borderlands, particularly in terms of lore and history.
Yes.
And the two do not exist without the other. And there are the on so many aspects, the Ozarks are a crossroads, which is in and of itself interesting from a hoodoo perspective. That
One big crossroad.
one giant conjuring crossroads in the middle of the United States. I probably am going to regret having said that. But it really, that
I'll take
the
credit for it, so you don't have to regret it.
I the the lore that is associated with Fog Monster is not dissimilar to the lore that's associated with so many of the other primate cryptid experiences or phenomena sightings that have taken place for close to 200 years in the region.
Exactly. And, and one reason it tends to be a little more infamous is because it was turned into a drama horror movie by Charles Pierce. And centering around probably the most famous encounters the Ford family had with the creature in 1971. And I think one thing that's, that is kind of interesting about this is that a lot of the Bigfoot encounters and tales in the Ozarks region tend to be of a fairly reclusive creature that tries to avoid, for the most part, avoid contact with people. There are some exceptions. There are some early accounts of the Ozark wild man attacking people, although they were chasing him at the time, and the blue man being aggressive towards loggers in southern Missouri in the 1860s. But from what perspective, that may well have been as a consequence to them coming too close to habitat or what was perceived as aggression from the men. It's hard to know. But the Fount monster tends to overall seem to be a little more aggressive and certainly more perhaps careless in attacking animals, in the open, that kind of thing, that you don't get with a lot of the other accounts, mutilated hogs, etc. And then apparently just taking offense at the Ford family.
Quite possibly. And for the record, the original films I really like.
I do too.
I actually love the cinematography, and they were shot on location. They were many of the individuals who were extras in the film are just folks who live in the region. And monster aside, it is to me a really beautiful film, or beautiful films, just showing the region and showing the what I would consider to be the very stately quality of this ecosystem as a whole, and in a interesting, sometimes cliched, but sometimes, in my opinion, very positive representations of some of the locals. I do have to admit, my introduction to the Fount monster actually comes from the fact that Boggy Creek 2 and the Legend Continues was featured in Mystery Science Theater 3000, and is one of my all-time favorite episodes of Mystery Science Theater 3000, with some of my favorite lines from Crow T. Robot and Tom Servo, because I'm a huge fan. But it doesn't change the fact that there is an enormous compendium of lore that is associated with this region, and I think that it is, skeptics aside, reasonable to say that there is something in the swamp.
There does seem to be something in the swamp. And you have recurring accounts now of about 170 years. And so this isn't something that just happened once and these people make it up or exaggerate and nothing ever happened. There were sightings after that up to the current time, as well as going back a very long time. So something seems to be going on, definitely.
It does.
Um,
It does.
and
That's very fair.
and
And-
Pierce, who did the movie, was actually had an encounter as a child, and then when the story about the Ford family came up, that's when he ended up doing the movie. But part of it was because of his own experience that had stayed with him, which I find very interesting. And your comment about the Ozarks being one big crossroads kind of makes me think, one thing that always kind of gets me is in the movie they show driving down Highway 71, down in Arkansas, and one of the more famous reportings of the monster is it walking across Highway 71, which is very interesting for me because I live a couple of miles away from Highway 71, and just to think that it's literally the same road,
Right.
down there, that we're not that disconnected and disjointed, and I just find that sort of a romantic notion, I guess.
It is, and I like it, and and we've seen similar. It's just a moment of numerological synergy, but Highway 61 going up the Mississippi in northern Missouri is also associated with the Momo, which is another Missouri monster cryptid.
That's true.
Again, not dissimilar to the Falk monster.
Very true, and sort of the main sightings for Momo were not too far different in time than the Ford sightings for the Holt monster.
That's very true. That is very true. Unrelated, it's also within the time frame of the Piedmont UFOs, but I don't think that
it's slightly before that. Yeah.
I'm not actually tying those together, at least not today.
No, please don't. We're not going there tonight.
I have the baseball cap. I have the black baseball cap that has a UFO and Bigfoot on it. So that's all the proof I need. It is a great baseball cap. I will wear it for the next episode.
Wonderful. and I know you will. That's the thing.
I know. I am nothing if not predictable.
Maybe. So now what beastie?
Oh, well, I'm always up for the compendium of Celtic beasties, and just looking for cross references of things that happen in the Ozarks. Also, some full. I think it's important to properly contextualize the lore in association with the Ozarks. We've talked about how the 20th century largely robbed us of our ancestral lineage when it comes to folklore. And consequently, there are mythological and other beasties of the British Isles that may inform lore in the Ozarks, but the connective tissue is often lost.
I agree. And for some, that tends to mean, there is no connection, two different things, two separate things. But I agree, it's not that simple.
No, it isn't. And what I, you know, as we just begin this portion of the discussion, what I encourage people to do is consider these aspects that the the cosmology that we're dealing with, for lack of a better term, the cosmology of the lore that we do have documented in the British Isles informs elements of this supernatural worldview that you see in Appalachia and you see in the Ozarks. Although, again, as I mentioned, some of that connective tissue has been lost and sometimes mixed with other traditions. So it is fascinating as points of comparison, just as you can't really wrap your head around all of the lore in the Ozarks without including Germanic lore, without including Cherokee lore, without including African American lore. Um, these all connect, these all inform the development of traditional Ozarkian folklore, but they are also they are connected, they are also separate, and you have to play in that middle ground to really develop a larger perspective. What we do know, though, in terms of recreating that connective tissue between the British Isles and the Ozarks, is that enormous numbers of early European settlers into, or Americans into, the Ozarks, as for example, Missouri was becoming a state in 1921, as Arkansas was following suit not terribly long afterwards. The individuals coming in, these were largely Tennessee and Kentucky settlers. These were largely Scotch-Irish. And on an ancestral level, and sometimes on a literal level, they were bringing with them these stories.
Very much so. So where do you want to start?
Oh, I think just jumping over on our notes to page 14, just very briefly, the concept of the fairies, of the Fae, which we've talked a little bit about already, and just tying initially into the fairy trees, predominantly the hawthorn, this overarching idea that certain trees have great spiritual meaning and that certain trees exist as gateways into the other world, and that they have to be regarded, you walk lightly within these spaces. And as with much of the Ozarks, and as just with the story of humanity, this is an existing a simultaneous contradiction, because on one hand, Ozarkers made their living out of logging, which certainly is a contradiction with the idea of the Fae. But at the same time, there are moments in which certain trees are regarded as particularly special, interesting, strange, cursed. The 2 points that I think would be interesting, one, is that even into comparatively recent times, certain cedar trees were noted as attracting an infestation of copperheads. And we still don't actually know why. And it could happen in somebody's yard, and you go out, and usually I think around August, and for whatever reason, every copperhead in the country has decided they love this tree. And so your friendly cedar tree in the backyard is dripping with copperheads. And that's unsettling.
That's unsettling. And then the flip side is that cedar, particularly with Native Americans in the region, is used for protection, and cedar boughs put over doorways, etc. for protection. And so it's almost, the antithesis of its normal use.
Yes, which in terms of the witch fairy motif, that it comes to be expected. The thing that is the ward also becomes the point of power.
True. And that follows through with some of the Cherokee lore as well.
It makes for a very for our contemporary sensibility, it becomes very confusing because the thing that's supposed to protect you becomes the weapon of the thing that is ostensibly endangering you.
Yes, tread lightly.
Yes, or vice versa. Uh, and that's when it gets into that really interesting space of it depends. And along with that, just jumping off for a moment, this isn't specifically a beast, but it is a folkloric manifestation that I find really interesting. And this is jumping up into your part of the Ozarks, is the hanging tree that was not cut down.
Yes. And actually, I was thinking about that earlier when we were talking about the trees and their meaning. Traditionally, and this isn't just endemic to the Ozarks, but a tree that was used for a hanging was viewed as unlucky, and that it would draw hauntings to it, which has overtones of the Fae just there too, that would draw spirits to it. So the remedy was to cut it down. And this, although it's a traditional belief, it became more prominent during the Civil War because you had a number of lynchings in the Burnt District during the war. And so tales would kind of grow up around those hanging trees, and they try to cut them down. There is one that isn't too far from where I live. The lore was that soldier was lynched along the stage road, and the tree was not cut down, mainly because there weren't too many people around at the time because it was depopulated. And then over time, it's become a matter of debate of where exactly was the hanging tree along the road. Is it still there? And the general area tends to have a number of hauntings, and there's some conjecture that perhaps the reason there's so many hauntings in that area is because the hanging tree was not cut down.
Yeah. And and I think I really, this speaks to something that is incredibly difficult to document, other than identifying the area and seeing if you can gather EVPs, etc.
Right. But I can say that there are a number of hauntings in that vicinity, that very close vicinity. It is a matter of talking even to elderly residents and hearing what they say from their parents and grandparents, that there's disagreement. What was it, this tree, or was it down the block, or was it a block over? Exactly where. And then some say, well, the tree's dead now, it's gone. Some say no, it's still living, which there certainly are trees in that area, a few trees in that area that would have been there during the Civil War and large enough to have been the hanging tree at that time. So we may just have spirits floating around looking for it. I'm not sure.
And it brings up an unsettling aspect that messes with us, because it goes beyond basic corporeal science.
Right.
But the idea And I personally believe that this idea holds merit in certain circumstances and locations, is that at points of violent death, that there is a resonance created that does something within the space.
I agree, and maybe not in every instance, but certainly in a number. I do think that's true based on my experience investigating. Yes.
And so you know, and going along with that, and something that, and this does date back to the old world, there is a and I wish I could find the documentation of this. It was very fascinating to me because it was in an engineering magazine that my dad got in the early 90s, and I wish I had saved it, because it was detailing some early 90s, essentially, EMF, EVP, and electromagnetic field and electronic voice phenomena, and early digital camera work that was done in a reportedly extremely haunted castle in Scotland.
Interesting.
And this was published sort of as a you know, interesting out of the ordinary piece, but it was detailing the tech that was being involved, but it was also being presented in this magazine from a serious standpoint. It wasn't, you know, this wasn't a tabloid magazine. This was a magazine that traditionally dealt with things like, you know, a turbine function and you know, those types of things. But it detailed that a number of very unsettling phenomena had been recorded. What appeared to be disembodied voices, some words coming through on the EVPs that were not friendly. And the particular space within the Scottish castle, and I now that I'm talking about this, I'm like trying to figure out how we can narrow it down to find which one it was. But it was a particular dungeon well in which a number of people had been executed.
Oh, I think I know. I think I do. I have read and actually seen documentaries about that, about a castle that fits that description with the dungeon well.
Okay.
But I can't think of which castle it is off the top of my head. But yes. Yeah, and particularly rather gruesome, gruesomely built, so that when they throw people into it, they were impaled.
Yes.
Yes.
And so some really interesting documentation was done in the early 90s that was recorded in this engineering magazine. And just thinking about that, I can't help but draw comparisons with various aspects. One, spilled blood. Spilled blood seems to be a focusing point for creating this sort of almost rift within space. That seems to, for example, attract hauntings as well as potentially be a haunting. It seems to attract hauntings as well. It also, and for people who are like, wait a second, you're talking about ghosts, you're not talking about beasts or fantastical or mythological beings. There is in the lore a very interesting intersection between ghost and fae and fey beast. Those
Mhm.
things tend to exist sort of not just alongside each other, but within the same matrix.
Yes, at times, yes.
And along with that, another thing that I can't help but just draw some comparisons. I'm jumping subjects, I know, but from the Hanging Tree is haunted operating rooms.
That is a jump, but yes.
It's got, yeah, and my thought on this, just as I'm going, is um individuals having not deliberately having a similar type of death, which creates a resonance which may attract more than just ghosts.
Mhm.
But regardless of the intent, the idea that dying in surgery is not unlike a violent death.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you look at it from the third person, um, as someone perhaps on the other side of the veil or the fae, etc., would, um, it really is the same mechanism. It's and I guess you could say that the difference would be whether or not there would be the emotions involved at the moment of death, but I'm not sure that for all those beings that is the crucial point. I'm not sure. That's interesting. And certainly, operating rooms do tend to be extremely um, haunted areas in hospitals, almost on par with morgues. I've always found it sort of interesting in an odd way that morgues have so many hauntings associated with them, as well as cemeteries, although I find that cemeteries tend not to generally be haunted, although they're reputed to be haunted. There are some exceptions. Um, I've also, in investigating areas that had morgues, uh, have not really encountered one that had any activity that I experienced or investigators with me experienced, although there are certainly stories. Um, uh, but more operating rooms than morgues.
Mm-hmm. And again, my theoretical conjecture on this is, yes, we are dealing with spirit hauntings, but we're also running the possibility that other aspects of the other worlds may be attracted to these points.
And I do think that is I do think that's reasonable and a possibility, especially some of these creatures or monsters that tend to have almost a vampiric or a werewolf type aspect to them, uh, tend to be drawn to and are seen in areas of death.
Mm-hmm. And this is so the larger overarching point for our listeners is that there's a number of people who've experienced phenomena that doesn't quite seem to all make sense.
Right, or necessarily just be explained by a pure haunting.
Right. And so this is sort of our mind-bending episode to take into account that uh, there are potentially lots of things that could be coming into play. On our notes on page 28, there was a particular entity that I found interesting in terms of tying in, which is the Glashjig. It is a Scottish ghost that often appears as a beautiful woman in a green dress with a gray visage and long yellow hair. However, her attire is in part disguise because the lower half of her body is that of a goat.
Interesting. A bit like Deer Woman.
That's what I was thinking. That's exactly what I was thinking.
Yes.
And there's also a little bit of a tie, even in the note in the notes, that cross ties her to the Babanshee, which is an Irish vampire ghost woman fae manifestation.
Well, yes, and Deer Woman in Cherokee and lore and Quapaw lore has similar characteristics. Not quite so much the vampiric per se, but certainly um, a quality of stealing energy, stealing life, even if it's not through blood.
Yeah, and there is the aspect, while not vampiric in the idea of I'm there to drain someone of their blood. The deer woman exists as a cautionary tale because she kills men.
She does, particularly men that have not treated women well.
Yes, which is has some very strong similarities with Irish folklore,
Mhm.
and in that regard, it is interesting. Coming back to one of our previous points, this particular bit of lore with the glass jig and comparing her with Deer Woman does strongly substantiate the idea that we're dealing with sort of in this case, we might be dealing with a singular plane of phenomena.
Mhm.
And then, as each people group is interacting, they begin to create their own lore to contextualize it, but they're contextualizing essentially the same type of phenomena.
Yes. And Dear Woman is a good example of that. I've heard versions of it where she is the ghost of a woman that's been murdered by a man, as well as versions where she is more of that other type creature that is interacting, but she's not a human ghost.
Right. And
Mhm.
that is distinctive, because again we're so oftentimes now dealing with a being that is simultaneously corporeal and non-corporeal.
Mhm.
The idea is that with a ghost, it is almost always is simply regarded, as much as we can compartmentalize anything, that a ghost is non-corporeal.
Right.
And that on the opposing end of the spectrum, for example, the concept of a cryptid like Bigfoot is that Bigfoot is always corporeal. And then we're now in this really interesting territory of somewhere in between.
Yes. Well, and even in native lore in this area, the Quapaw, the Ewa fits that category.
It does. And let's talk about that just for a moment because of that connection with the Ozarks. The concept of the Ewa, because the Ewa is there's a couple of things I really like just in terms of the discussion of the Ewa. And the first one is that the Ewa is not an ancestor spirit.
Yes, specifically not an ancestor spirit. Ancestor spirits are are just spirit. The Ewa are seen as a trickster, uh, mischievous, in some cases even more malevolent, um, and that it is spirit and a physical entity at the same time.
And that, again, if you're not accustomed to this type of lore, doesn't seem like it should be possible.
Right. But and I really like that lore because it very much pairs with a lot of Celtic lore as far as concept, which I like because it shows that that idea is not just endemic to the Celts.
Right. And I think that is very, very reasonable. And something that, just from a cultural standpoint, something that we saw that many people don't realize took place is that many of our Celtic forebears, when they ended up in Appalachia, and later when they ended up in the Ozarks, there was a lot of cultural similarities between the Celts and the Cherokee, as an example.
Yes. They were not entirely amiss from each other.
No,
As well with some of the culture, the Osage as well.
correct. And I think that we see aspects of that cultural cross-pollination taking place that's really, really interesting. And of particular interest to me, which again, I really think is beautiful and fascinating and just extraordinary in its complexity of the human story, is that there's, for example, a number of individuals I know who have, first of all, are on the rolls in Oklahoma with enough Native American ancestry to qualify them to be able to carry their American Indian or First Nation cards to qualify for example, for healthcare, et cetera, in Oklahoma with the tribes. And these are individuals oftentimes with blue eyes, some cases sandy blonde hair, complexions that are lighter than mine. And that was one conversation I had with a friend who does have strong Native American background, and looking at me going, "Josh, you're darker than I am," and I'm like, "Well, I'm Welsh, so there you go." But but again, it reminds me of that conversation I had years and years ago with a merchant artist actually at Silver Dollar City. It was 20 years ago, and she's blonde, blue eyes, and she's talking to me about how important her Cherokee ancestry is to her, and mentioning from an ancestral lineage point and from a basically a spiritual manifestation point, that in her words, she heard the drums.
I've heard that before.
And I found that really beautiful. And that was the first time that I'd ever heard that term. And I had to say, "Oh, time out. What are you talking about?" And and at least from my conversation with her, and I may need to further contextualize this, with the idea that certain people of Cherokee ancestry at certain times in their life, particularly at moments of high portent, will hear ancestral drumming that is distinct, and in some cases they may be the only person to hear it, but it speaks very profoundly to them.
Yes, which goes right back to the definition we started with.
Yes. Yes, it does. On our notes on page 35 at the bottom, the Cublinai is a bit of Welsh lore in regards to essentially gnome miners, not too terribly far removed from the Tommyknockers.
Yes, yes. And that basically they came with the Welsh to America and were encountered by miners here.
Yes, and to me this is particularly interesting. Of course, the tri-state mining district is a crucial part of the Ozarks and the Ozarks story, and not part of the separate, not part of the Ozarks, but my ancestors landed in southern Iowa, which is at the time was coal mining country. Again,
Mhm.
lots and lots of mining associated and a lot of lore wrapped around that. And it's something that I think bears a little bit of discussion is aspects of mining because of its conflict with nature, essentially. Like
Mhm.
the individuals who are mining were putting themselves into extremely high risk environments.
Mhm.
Is not, in a weird sort of way, and in a folkloric sort of way, is not dissimilar from sailing, the great sailing lore that and the superstition surrounding it.
That's true. That is an interesting parallel I hadn't thought about, but very true. Lots of danger, lots of risk, um, and the need to be able to figure things out in a crisis. It's funny, some of the lore with the Koblai um, are that they would be helpful to the miners, and they would knock in places where there were rich veins of mineral or metal, whatever they were mining for. And it reminds me of a story in the tri-state district of a mining engineer, particularly Arthur Bindalari, who uh, was known to just have that touch, um, um, an uncanny ability to find mines, to sink holes in the right place. And in fact, the how the Pitcher mining field, which is in the tri-state district, just over the Oklahoma line, and became the richest lead district in the world, really fits this lore because they had gone down to around Veneta, Oklahoma, thinking that there might be a vein down there. And this is in about 1914, 1915. And so all the mining equipment, it's on wagon. This is that long ago. And they struck out, didn't find anything. So they were coming back towards Joplin. And almost as if someone knocking or whatever, they have a wagon break down. And so they have to fix the wagon before they can move on. So Bindalari decides, what the heck, I'm going to sink a test hole while he's waiting. And so by accident hits the largest vein of lead found in the world.
Oh, they probably I may have been talking to him.
That's what it made me think of, because it was like it was just completely unplanned, you know, almost you would think off the cuff, but perhaps there was a reason the wagon broke down where it did. Which
is vastly interesting. And you know, when you look at Pitcher, Oklahoma today, the sort of the modern retelling that what the Fae give you, they also take away.
Very, very true. Very true. Now, of course, is advertised as, you know, ghost town, etc. Technically isn't, because there actually are a few people still there, but the town has been bought out because of lead contamination from the chat piles. And I can still remember people, you know, coming through and people driving through who weren't from the area who thought they were mountains. So
Wow. Yeah. It's again there's something that I think we lose when we lose our ancestral ties. What we often lose with it is the cautionary tale to remain in balance.
very true. And often what happens is in some way we end up having to relearn that lesson
Over and over and over. The understanding that we must exist in balance in order to move on to the next generation successfully often stands in the way of mass profit,
True.
which I think is interesting, because how many times does the lost treasure and the fairy gold play a role in these stories?
Often they do, and then in modern life they do in reality, so to speak.
So I think that there are some strong parallels that cross all of these boundaries, all of these lines, and we can learn so much, whether you believe in the Fae or not, whether you believe in cryptids or not. There's so much that you can learn in terms of our ancestral past.
I agree, and be informed for lessons for the very real modern world. That may be a good place to end tonight. We want you to not forget to check out upcoming events and merchandise at darkozarks.com and paranormalsciencelab.com. Thank you again to Always Buying Books and Beard Engine Brewing Company for helping to bring the Dark Ozarks to everyone.
And on our next episode, we are going to be discussing seances and spiritualism. Catch the Dark Ozarks podcast on Branson Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Google Podcasts, Substack, or about any other podcast platform. Thank you, everyone. And remember, there are no easy answers in the Dark Ozarks.